Welcome to Journey of an Aesthete podcast. I hope the sound is okay. Always double check and double check the sound. Our producer, Laurie Strickland, and Chester, her companion, our producers, usually get back to us on that. So I trust it'll be fine. This, of course, is the final episode of our 4-part series on two great writers, two giants in prose, Joan Didion and her husband, JohnGregoryDunne. And today is sort of a little bit of a, what phrase would I use? A little bit of a treat, a little bit of a kind of a, not really, it's more in a spirit of fun than a spirit of, being too serious about prose, although we're going to deal with prose and we're going to always do close reading. But we're talking about one of the greatest unofficial genres in art. I should say, I'm trying to think, include both prose and visual art, is, I'm going to call, I don't know what to call it, the unabashed, wild adventure of human behavior in our postmodern society that was so richly drawn and observed in the 1970s. And today's subject, of course, is Las Vegas. And the book we are discussing is JohnGregoryDunne temporarily separating from Joan, going to Vegas and writing about what he saw there in the very early 70s. And there's two things I want to mention. I, of course, want to mention to like and subscribe to our show if you want more programs like this one. But I'm going to go back to what we first started because I said at the outset, and I'm going to hold to this, hopefully not too dogmatically, but that when we're talking about a book like this, Vegas, look at the artwork. So beautiful. I love the artwork of those years in publishing design. When I'm talking about a book like Vegas or Where I Come From, or any of the things we've been discussing, or of course, Blue Nights, we are discussing what, for lack of a better word, we call prose. So it's writing. It's meant to be read on a piece of paper, or if it must be on the screen. And we started off with a theory or idea or ideal that philosophically informs this entire podcast. So it's kind of a big deal, I'm going to say, that subject matter, psychology, even story and plot is secondary to style. And we're going to kind of, in a way, sort of prove that in this episode, if such a thing could even be proven. That's not to say that subject is not important. It's important, but it's if it weren't the other way around. So if it were the other way around, we would not have books or movies. In other words, we would just look at summaries of everything, outlines of everything, and just let our imagination run wild about what the summary, every person their own artist or something, which is, no. Or it would just be only the summary, right? And so imagine a world of all these clunky scenarios. And we're going to demonstrate that because I'm going to start off with a passage in Vegas. I'm going to read you from JohnGregoryDunne's prose. Now, Dunne is writing about the 70s. He's writing as part of this genre of, sometimes people have called it, feminist scholars have called it men behaving badly. And feminist criticism. I just call it wildness, a kind of a wild, I would call it get in touch with your feelings mode. And you leave aside responsibilities of all kinds. And so JohnGregoryDunne goes to report on Vegas. And I'm not going to get into every aspect of this book. It's a wonderful book. But I am going to get into this issue of style of prose. So Joan Didion writes about California. She writes so much about California. there's a very well thought out, well executed through her syntax, because Joan Didion studied Henry James and Ernest Hemingway. They're really, I can't think of any better models for a writer than those two. In fact, there aren't any better. I mean, I could throw in a couple other names, but I won't. Copying out the sentences, but the major difference between the wife and husband here is Joan Didion starts off with a kind of background reflectiveness. So, for example, Where I Come From is her second thoughts about California after having written about California in the 60s and 70s. And she lays out all of these facts and figures about water, and I visited the water and drought, and there's a passage here where she talks about how the government subsidized everything. So for Joan Didion, when she writes about her native California and where I was from, okay, she starts out from, I guess you might say, a goal. Could be a philosophic goal, spiritual goal, we can throw in fancy words. This, of course, is part of being a journalist. So this is something, incidentally, that both she and her husband share. I mentioned that JohnGregoryDunne reported on the great worker strike and Chavez, and he's also, you can see here, he's written on Hollywood and running for Hollywood, 2 books. The Studio, from this same era as Vegas, and later on in the 90s, Monster. So they both come from a journalistic perspective, but again, why is style so decisive? Well, let's look at Joan Didion for a second. I'm trying to find the right this is from Where I Was From, which she wrote, I think, in the late 90s, I think. Great book. I can't recommend highly enough. Where I Was From, one of the great books on California. So this is just number 3. She says, a good deal about California does not, on its preferred terms, add up. The Sacramento River, the main source of surface water in a state where distrust of centralized government authority has historically passed for an ethic, has its headwaters in the far northern ranges of Siskiyou County. It then picks up the waters of the McCloud and the Pitt Rivers, above Redding, of the Feather and the Yuba and the Bear below Knight's Landing, of the American at Sacramento, of the San Joaquin below Steamboat Slough, and the empties through San Francisco Bay into the Pacific, draining the deep snowpacks of the southern Cascades and the northern Sierra Nevada. This is a quote. The river is here about 400 yards wide. One of my great-great-grandfathers, William Kilgore, whose daughter Myra married into the Reese family, wrote in the journal of his arrival in Sacramento in August of 1850, quote, the tide raises the water about 2 feet, and steamboats and vessels are here daily. From this place to San Francisco is about 150 miles by water. All of this distance, the river has low banks and is subject to inundation for several miles back, unquote. Well, that's a mouthful, right? And then this is Didion says, that the land to which he intended eventually to bring his wife and 2 children was subject to inundation for several miles back seems not to have presented itself as an argument against immediate settlement. See that? Notice the tone there? Seems to have not presented itself. Quote, this is one of the trying mornings for me, as I now have to leave my family or back out, he had written in his journal 4 months before. Suffice it to say we started, unquote. Yet this river that had been from the beginning his destination was one regularly and predictably given during all but the driest of those years, before its flow was controlled or rearranged, to turning this valley into a shallow freshwater sea 100 miles long and as wide as the distance between the coast ranges and the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. A pattern of flooding the Army Corps of Engineers declared in 1927, more intense and intractable than that on any other American river system, including the Mississippi. Now that's a long passage, and I want to say it's so beautifully written. So Didion is doing two things in that prose. She's offering the reader all of these historic and, I should say, very technical facts, technical about where water comes from and where you're going to live. But she tucks into that political critique, self-criticism, attitudes of families. Are you going to settle here, and what the ethics of that? So there's a scientific basis, there's a technical basis, but on top of those things, which we might call the subject, there's the artfulness of her prose, the subordinate clauses, the rhythm, the rich, what I'm always coming back to, the syntax, and how that communicates her, for lack of a better word, quote unquote, story. Now that's a worldview of how to write nonfiction. It's a universe that Joan Didion creates for us and inhabits, which is, I would say it's largely ethical. I have referred to it in the past. I don't mean this by any denomination. I mean in the broadest possible sense of this word. It's spiritual. I mean, later on in this book, she's going to go on and on about how she realized that the government subsidized all the water that they have. And she talks about how, her, I don't want to get too far off topic, but she talks about the John Birchers in her family. She comes from a very, very right-wing, hyper right-wing family. And very much, Reagan-esque, long before Reagan, but Reagan picks an individual, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, entrepreneurship, commerce, money, that ethic. She was raised in that. After all, she was like Hillary Clinton, she was a Goldwater girl, as there are many Goldwater people of those years. But even when those were her politics, and I should say that at that same time, she's also hanging out with Jim Morrison. So again, you gotta love a person that, I'm gonna be a Republican. I don't buy this left-wing talk. I'm gonna vote, for Goldwater, but I'm also gonna hang out with Jim Morrison and check out the Doors. I'm not just one thing. I'm gonna independent thinking. When she's writing Where I Was From, Joan Didion is doing 180. She's changing. And she's moving to the left, and she's re-examining the myths, you might say, deceit, hypocrisy of Californians and how they interpret, too many of them, and as she mentions, interpret their history. I didn't want to go too, the reason I went so deep into that is that I want to lay the groundwork for looking at the prose of her husband. Writes about Sacramento, the water. Her husband leaves his wife, says, I'm going to Vegas. I'm going to write about Vegas. You got that prose in your consciousness and your nervous system. Where are we here? This is fun. So this is from part 2, and this, shall I give trigger warnings? This is the most graphic language we have ever used in our podcast. Pornographic language, that's where we are. It's beautiful writing, you'll see. This is a description of what we would now call a sex worker in Las Vegas, whose name is Artha. So I should say one difference. So I mentioned that Joan Didion keeps sort of a distance. She's brings in the facts, and she has this sort of consciousness of distance. Dunne dives right in. With Dunne, there's the, I guess it's conceit or idea of no distance, of sort of getting inside these people. Much, much more intimate. I have, no opinion at all about right or wrong. It's all style. you know, we all prefer some styles to others, but there's a. Well, I just want you to read this passage. This passage is about sex, okay? But this is typical of the writing of that era, and I miss it dearly because the writing of today's era is both more coy and moralistic, and this is not. Here we go. I'm going to get a drink of coffee. All right. This is about Artha. In her 5 years in Vegas, Artha had kept the following statistics. She had turned 1,203 tricks with 1,076 different Johns. 97 tricks had been unable to get an erection. 214 came before penetration. She had engaged in anal intercourse 88 times and fellatio 863 times. She had had 13 professional lesbian contacts and 3 non-professional, and had been hired for multiples or group sex 54 times. She had been whipped professionally 11 times, and in turn had strapped tricks with a belt 23 times and with a horsewhip once. The masochist generally preferred to get whipped around the genitals, the sadist to whip her buttocks. One client had paid her $300 to clip off her pubic hair, which he then put in a mason jar. She never saw him again. Her vagina had been successfully penetrated by penises, dildos, bottles, bananas, frankfurters, candles, and vibrators, and unsuccessfully by a pop-top can of Fresca. You got that very so similar to Didion, the list, but not just the subject matter is what's different. It's the sharp crispness. And so it said she had taken accounting in high school in Milwaukee and kept the statistics in a loose-leaf three-ring binder notebook. There was a check mark for each occurrence and a date, and at the bottom of a column, the ledger was totted up. She said that she kept her records in lieu of keeping a diary, making each entry in green ink with an old Parker 51 fountain pen. The statistics were neatly marked on accounting paper that she bought in a stationery store in the Maryland Parkway shopping mall, and a notebook separated by foul dividers with such headings as whippings and sucking. She did not know the meaning of fellatio or cunnilingus, and when I defined them for her, she thought the words were cute. So that's a description of a person does a certain kind of work. Now, he develops confidants in this character. There are entertainers. Of course, it's Vegas. There are bookies. There are all kinds of hangers-on and interesting people. But he gets very close to them. So he spends so much time with Artha, and he does not sleep with her. He does not have sex with this woman at all, as far as we can tell. But he hangs out with her and learns about her life. And it turns out she's a poet. And he reads her poetry, and they talk about her poetry. Try to get to what I mean by the crispness. It's a crisp. Here we go. Now this is John Gregory Dunne's report on his own life living in Vegas. He says, "Time took on a kind of pattern. For days on end, I did not leave the apartment. I subsisted on a diet of Clark bars and Hydrux cookies and Hostess Twinkies and, when I was feeling flush, cans of macadamia nuts. I drank Coca-Cola out of the deposit bottles because I was sure that the taste in the no-return bottles was sweeter, different, not so much carbonation. I ate Nikos, the little host-like candy wafers, and Oreos, and Florentine Poggins. I don't know if Florentine, it's been a while. These are dated foods, maybe not. These are junk food from the 60s and 70s. I ate cube steak and Macintosh apples and Ritz crackers with Laura Scudder crunchy peanut butter. I got fat." Now, when he says I got fat, that's, see how the prose looks? I got fat has, it gets its own, see? I received a letter in the mail one day from a man in Cincinnati. We had never met, and he had never read anything I had written, but he knew my address at the Royal Polynesian Apartments. He said he had seen my picture in a magazine, and he was deeply into ESP. So imagine you're a writer, you're in Vegas, you're hanging out with a sex worker, hearing about all her graphic jobs, and you just get a letter out of the blue from a guy that wants to talk about extrasensory perception. So I want to say only in the 70s. Again, this is so what I want to say about this book, why I love this book, is that in this mode of prose, the least important thing is for we, the reader, or him, the writer, or even any of the people, his characters he's talking about, the least important thing is for anybody to do anything about anything. It's sort of the joy of the ride. It's the pleasure of the experience. It's the word people use. It's the color, the texture of the situation is above all the most important thing. And that's a style, and you can do a lot. And it's achieved, of course, by the rhythm of his prose and how he uses short, very, very short types of sentences. Let me read some more from this. It's interesting. Again, more of this staccato. This is a style. I met Marvin Berlin the way I met everyone in Vegas. I called him on the telephone. They used to have these things called telephones. You would call people on them. Okay. I called him on the telephone. I talked for hours on the telephone, mainly to kill time, but also to encourage the self-delusion that I was working, that I was getting a feel of the community, that I was surfeiting myself with local color. See, he uses the phrase local color. I didn't know. The telephoning had the same narcotic effect as driving the freeways. I studied the yellow pages as if they were the key to the universe. He's studying the yellow pages as if they were the key to the universe. And then would dial an accordion instructor or an abdominal support salesman. I have no idea. What is an abdominal support salesman? Is that some kind of a non-legal medical? I have no idea. I talked to exterminators and contraceptive wholesalers. We've already encountered contraception in the first passage I read, but bail bondsmen and private detectives. I slept fitfully an hour here, 2 hours there, masturbating frequently, trying to find the release for sleep. I had insomnia, and in the gray hours before dawn, I could hear the whistle of a train, a freight 90, 100 cars long, snaking across the desert on the tracks behind Circus. I belong to a different generation. He says he belonged to a different generation. I had not heard the sound of the freight since my childhood summers in Saybrook, Connecticut. In Los Angeles, when he was living there, I used to go to the airport Sunday mornings to buy the New York Times and then park the car at the end of the runway number 1 while the jet screeched over, not 50 feet above the road, the screech of the engines loud enough to puncture the eardrums. I felt like an electronic Mr. Lonely Hearts. At 3 or 4 in the morning, people were somehow amenable to talking to a stranger on the telephone. Before dawn one morning, I called an all-night drugstore that was advertising a special, 1,000 prophylactics for the price of $7.50. Any takers? I said. You the press or something? No, I just can't sleep. I saw the sign when I was buying some crash yesterday. Interesting. Can't give them away. Really? You got to be an optimist. You think? Jesus, buddy. That's 3 years there. Anybody who's done that every day for the last 3 years, you just send him in. And there's all this kind of discussion of rubbers and sexuality. And now, the subtitle of this text is A Memoir of a Dark Season. And I guess people call it, he calls it, Joan Didion calls it dark, a dark season. I suppose from one point of view that's the case. But I find this book and all of its color infinitely fascinating. And there's, I should say, in this book, actually a love he has. This reporter has in some way, in his own way, fashion, a love for all the people he meets. And it's in this text. And his curiosity and his love, I think, goes a long way towards, I think, brightening this book and perhaps brightening his season. You're encountering people at the limits of their experience, and the limits of their experience and consciousness, and that is always interesting. And you come away reading Vegas in a way so if a book today about Vegas would not give us any of this, because it would start from mission. I mean, of course, John Gregory Dunne has a sort of a mission. I'm going to get these stories. I'm going to capture what it's like to be a guy lonely in this town. But that's the extent of it. But it's not trying to be a comprehensive moral or ethical assessment of Vegas or these people. And that's a profound difference. And that's a sense in which I think this book, I think it's being re-released or republished. The book has value. Just gonna find something here. I want to find that the poem that there's a passage about the poetry. Oh, where are we here? Is this it? Damn. Give me 1 second. You know, the thing about older books is because the paper is unevenly cut and finished. So it's here we go. This is what she wrote. I think there's a couple things. So any event, he's waiting in the casino for Arthur. It says, in spare moments, Arthur wrote poetry herself, often in the Teesdale manner. Sometimes while in a casino waiting for a late date, John or Trick was late, she would scribble a poem on the back of a Keno card. Here's one of her poems, Arthur's poem. Starlight, moon bright, will I save my life tonight? In the stillness of the morn, the question is, why was I born? So Arthur's itinerary, any event, they have a discussion because John Gregory Dunne actually in his spare time starts writing about and talking about his poetry instruction that he received in way back when he's in one of the Ivy League schools. I don't know forget which one. He studied poetry, and so he literally starts talking to Arthur about poetry. And the elements of poetry, and I think that was kind of interesting. Bringing the very profane and the sacred together, and bringing high art poetry. But let's hear some of Arthur's opinions about culture. What she has to say about movies like Clute. So he's hanging out with Arthur. They go to a lot. It says they go to a lot of porno movies. I should say going to a porno movie in 1971 and 72 in the theater is a very, well, that's probably a radically different experience than anybody's had really recently. She claimed to have made one that she had never seen, meaning a porn movie, and the possibility of seeing herself on screen was always her pretext for making me take her to whatever Skinner was playing in town. She says, "Did you ever see a guy in a dirty movie who didn't have a tattoo?" I guess she's commenting that, she says, "I've got to go to Engelbert Humperdinck's show tonight." So she's watching a dirty movie, and she's saying to Joan Didion, she's saying, "We got to get out of here this movie because I'm seeing Engelbert." Engelbert Humperdinck was a big entertainer. And then she says, "Oh, I have to make it to Dean Martin's opening." So she has a schedule. She actually goes to these shows, and she was sharp. Here we go. Here's a passage. She was sharply critical on professional grounds of Jane's performance. That is Jane Fonda. Include. She says, "That broad could never pussy whip anybody," is Arthur's quote. And she tried to make a date during the hour-and-a-half Dick Cavett show on... She tried never to make a date during the hour-and-a-half Dick Cavett show on the air. She loved Dick Cavett. She said when I once asked her why she preferred Cavett to Carson, she replied, "Johnny plays the Sahara." That's all she has to say about it. So I guess Dick Cavett is more pure and maybe less. Probably because she sees him less. She sees Carson too often, I guess, or something. Who knows? It's all very interesting to me. I wish they wrote books like this today. I don't know if it's actually possible. So I want to talk about that a little bit before we conclude. I mean, I do think that certain styles of art have conditions of possibility and impossibility. So sometimes works of art aren't possible because there's no public for it. Possibly. There's no interest. There's another reason that occurs to me now, which is probably the biggest reason of all, is that sometimes societies change so radically. And I don't just mean the material reality. I mean inside. Humans change radically. Humans are not the same. I'm sorry to have got news for you. Humans are not the same from century to century. That they just are not so constituted to interpret things in a certain one way or the other. Or they do different things with their time. Those are all sorts of reasons. So, but putting aside that discontinuity of history and artistic style, is someone that does music from all different eras and combines them. There's no actual rule, really, about any of this. So you really could write a book like this about any subject, not about Vegas or about her profession, but about, I don't know, gardening or a divorce or truck driving or, I don't know, being a political activist or running for the Senate. Who knows? On presidential campaigning. I don't know. Subject is always secondary, but what I'm saying is that you can write about any of those subjects pretty much in any way you want to, so long as you internalize into your nervous system the rules of the style. And also, take seriously the effect that style is going to have on, in this case, the reader or the viewer, if it's a movie or anything else. So it's going to be a shorter episode today because there's just one book and you get a flavor of John Gregory Dunne's Vegas. Next week, we'll return to a much more highbrow series, Isaiah Berlin, Romanticism, and the art of letter writing and correspondence. So I do hope you have a good weekend, and it's MitchHampton, and look forward to feature episodes on Journey of an Aesthete podcast. Good day.